Today on the Bible Reading Challenge podcast, we are going to give an overview of the book of Ruth. My name is Aaron Ventura, and I'm joined today by Dr. Tim Edwards. Dr. Edwards, welcome back to the show for the 5th, 6th, 7th, I don't even know how many times we're at now.
I don't know.
Welcome back again.
It's fun.
So Ruth is one of the books that you taught me when I took first year Hebrew, and I still remember learning a bunch of different words for gleaning or grain. There's a bunch of different ones. Yeah. So this is a book that I figured you know probably inside and out. Can you start by telling us where this book kind of fits into the history of Israel, and even maybe also comment on its placement in the canon? So what's the function of this little story that we get?
So in the English Bibles, which follows the order actually of the Greek Septuagint, Ruth is placed after Judges, partly because it's set at that time period. It starts in the days when the judges were judging, and so it's placed at the chronologically in relationship to the Book of Judges, and ends with a looking forward to via the genealogy of Ruth and Boaz's son, Obed, to the kingdom of David. So it's chronologically set there, but it has a forward-looking focus in relationship to the kingdom of David that is coming. In the Hebrew canon, it's placed not next to the book of Judges, but placed after the book of Proverbs in the writings, and the reason being, Ruth is identified by Boaz as Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor. That Proverbs 31 finishes with that paean of praise to the woman of valor who could find such a woman, and so there's a direct connection between Proverbs ending and Ruth epitomizing that wise woman that everyone should seek after. So you have two settings one within the Greek ordering of the Bible and one within the Hebrew ordering, and both work fantastically well.
It's kind of interesting when you think about the wisdom literature, and when I first learned that, and then you read Proverbs 31 and then read Ruth, it does give it a different flavor, and especially because Proverbs is all about this lady wisdom, and if Ruth is this kind of epitome of lady wisdom, it's interesting that she's not a Hebrew, right? She's a Gentile. She's a foreigner, which is kind of a strange thing to think about.
That is very striking. But and also what's very striking when you read Proverbs 31, you have clearly a woman of substance. Yeah, she's doing international trade. She's purchasing vineyards for her husband.
She has muscular arms.
And then the one woman in the Bible is explicitly spoken of in those terms is a widow who owns nothing. Yeah. And so it warns us in one sense against just wooden biblicism. Yeah. The Bible says, look, this woman of valor, she does all these wonderful things, all this trade, and here's the best example of her, someone who's penniless, picking up leftovers in a field. Yeah.
Do you take Samuel as the author? Does that matter who wrote it? It seems to be written with some kind of homiletical purpose to it, and with the reference to the custom of the sandal coming off, it was probably written sometime after when that custom would at least have had to been explained.
Yeah, I mean, the author isn't identified. Samuel is one of the traditional possibilities for it. I have no reason to either doubt it, but certainly not any reason to die on that hill.
Yeah, it's you think if he anointed David as king and he's kind of going against the crowd, you could imagine that needing a little bit of explanation from time to time. So I thought this is a great story. There's so much in here. Maybe we could start with just the setting, names, places, some of the basic grammar of it. One of the things that comes up here is just names and their meaning in the Hebrew. So can you just introduce us to the main characters and what their names in Hebrew kind of connote or denote?
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's a very well crafted book. And that those first 5 verses, you have introduction to the character Elimelech, which is my God is king, and his wife and 2 sons. Naomi means sweet, or can be beauty in different contexts. The many people's favorite verse, "May the beauty of the Lord rest upon us." It's the Noam of the Lord, but really sweetness. And then they have 2 sons, sickness and destruction, which is you think,
You thought there would be something better than that, right?
Yeah, you think, my God is king and sweetness, when they come together, are going to produce more than sickness and destruction. But and so that sort of sets the scene up, and you have they leave Bethlehem. They're from Bethlehem, which is the house of bread, and it's a time of famine. And then the husband dies and the sons die, and so in 5 or so verses you have a dramatic portrayal of a time of terrible disaster.
Yeah.
And that things are not going well, and they leave the land. They marry Moabites who shouldn't be coming into the congregation of the Lord. And the guys, I mean, it's a very quick portrayal of the worst of times, and not the best of times.
Yeah. I think a lot of people come to the book of Ruth with almost maybe a romanticized version of this is a love story of, this Gentile woman marrying some rich guy, and, it's like a Jane Austen story or something. She has a come up, but that's really not what's going on here. And in order to understand it, you really have to go back to what's happened previously, all the way back to Moab, or Genesis 38, or Lot's incestuous relationship with his daughters. And then Bethlehem, we think Bethlehem, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, it's Christmas time.
Yes.
But Bethlehem was not a great place during the time. Can you tell us a little bit about the situation of Judges 19, and kind of how that casts a shadow over this initial section of maybe why there's a famine in Bethlehem?
Yeah, I mean, Judges as a whole is just one disaster after another, with the intermittent deliverance, with a judge who's raised up to portray that deliverance, and those judges themselves don't always quite fit our sort of ideal of a deliverer, shall we say? And then you have the story in Judges 19, and I completely forgot my reading glasses. So I bought my Hebrew Bible, and I can't see it very well.
The vowels are so small.
Yeah. So this is the.
Do you want my English Bible?
No, this is I wouldn't better read that. I've got my spectacles. So this is the chapter where you have the death of the concubine.
Yeah.
And so you have this it's one of the worst chapters in the Bible.
Yeah.
You have this gruesome treatment of this concubine in Bethlehem, and so the book of Judges just sets the scene of what it looks like when a people reject God and, as it says, do what's right in their own eyes.
Yeah.
Now, the relationship of the timing of Ruth and Judges 19 is unclear. When does Ruth seems to be coming towards the end of the book and time of Judges, but Bethlehem has been through a terrible time.
Yeah.
Now, what usually happens, and this is striking with the beginning of Ruth, when you think Abraham, he goes into the land. There's a famine. He goes out of the land.
Yeah.
God delivers him greatly. He comes out and comes back to the land wealthier than he went.
Yeah.
And so it's said in the time of Judges that things are disastrous. There's a famine. They leave the land, and they don't come back. Well, when they do come back, they come back poorer and in a worse state than they went off. So there's this overturn of the normal narrative expectation you have had, which again highlights things are not good.
Yeah. When you read the blessings and curses in Deuteronomy 28, it's very clear that God says, in the land, you're about to go take this land that I promised to give to Abraham, and what happens in the ground corresponds with what is happening in your heart, whether you're obeying God or not. And it seems like Elimelech here is kind of a false king. It's a false profession. In some ways, you might even say he has apostatized, where as if there's a famine, you should say, maybe we need to repent and make things right rather than going off to Moab. And then there's also some history with Moab. So can you tell us a little bit about how that plays in there, where they didn't offer bread to the Israelites as they were passing through?
Yeah, so Deuteronomy 23, isn't it? There are various groups are barred from entering into the congregation of Israel, and the Moabites are one of those groups, along with the Edomites, because they didn't offer hospitality, essentially, to Israel coming out of Egypt, and therefore it says they're barred up to the 10th generation. Now, what's also striking is the other group, the Edomites, are barred, but also those of illegitimate birth. In the Hebrew, the mamzerim. And what's striking is that both Moab and Ammon, but Moab are nations that had an illegitimate beginning from the incestuous relationship between Lot's daughters and Lot when they got him drunk. And so there's everyone goes, Moab, bad beginning, didn't meet us. In actual fact, the situation with Baal Peor, following Balaam's advice, Moabite ladies are used to seduce the Israelite men into the worship of foreign gods. So every Israelite household, the mothers sit their sons down and go, Moabite women, not a good idea.
Yeah, not a good idea. And you have that kind of hinted at with Orpah, who, so anytime, actually, before we get here, let's talk about Genesis 38, because you have another death of two sons.
Yeah, I do.
Similarly here, and in some ways, Ruth is a sequel to to what happens to the Perez, the Judah Tamar story. So you're reading along through Genesis, and you're following the Joseph story. Boom. You're like, why do we got this story about Judah, Tamar? And then it just goes back to the Joseph story. And then Ruth kind of picks up on this story about Perez. So, can you talk a little bit more about that relationship?
Yeah, so, I mean, in one sense, it's a similar plot. Judah is seemingly disheartened by all that's gone on, and decides to, leave the brothers, and he's married his son marries a Gentile woman. No. I'm completely going the emergency thing as well. So you have Tamar, who's Gentile, who marries his son. For whatever reason.
He's evil.
He's evil. He's bad. He doesn't want to raise the next generation with this woman, and then he gets given to another one, and then she gets sort of left on the shelf. And then Judah sleeps with her.
Right.
It's not, unbeknownst to him, it's Tamar, and yet she is declared righteous at the end. And what is striking in that story is Judah. Something happens in Judah, and you find in the rest of that story now Judah is becoming more of the leader that he is brought on, and so you have Ruth, Moabite, and marries Boaz, and through him you have the line of Judah, which comes from the line that's outlined at the end of Genesis 38, connected to David, and so you have this line that works, and you have two Gentile women who, if we're honest, don't do this at home, folks type attitude in some particular aspects. I'm thinking chapter 3 of Ruth, and obviously
we'll get to that.
Genesis
Courtship advice
38 with Judah and Tamar.
So the promise, I think, is in Genesis 49. The scepter will not depart from Judah. Suggests this messianic line. When Samuel does first anoint a king, it's not from the tribe of Judah.
It's not.
Can you talk a little bit about that, and is this some sort of false start? What's going on there?
I mean, lots of people ask those questions, throughout history. How come, why did a tribe come out of Benjamin for king and then it goes to Judah? And I've yet to see here's the exact answer, the reason why. And the discussion of the desire for a king is sort of both negative, and yet there's also a positive, because God has already given the law for the king.
Yeah.
And it seems like that initial desire for a king in the people, although God intends them to have a king, is not to be God's example of wisdom and how people should be ruled, but they just want to be like everyone else.
Yeah.
And so there's an element that Saul is a judgment that they wanted.
Yeah.
And after that, God says, now we're going to have the king that I've, from the tribe of Judah, that was always intended.
In some sense, it's almost like, so we just have this Supreme Court nominee, and it's a woman, and whatever you think about her, that's neither here nor there, but Deborah is this one example of a female judge who does some great and glorious things. However, we would say that that's not how it's supposed to be. There should be elders in the gate who are judging righteously. And so someone could do something righteous while, not necessarily being in the role that God intended them to be. And in some sense, you could say that Saul is this.
Saul was used by God to bring some deliverance to his people, but it was problematic from the start.
Yeah, he was super tall, so it's like
it was.
I should have tipped you off.
It was clearly going to go wrong. Yeah.
All right, so let's get into this story a little bit more. So Ruth says, "I'm going to go with you, Naomi," and Naomi kind of gives her an out. She says, "It's probably not going to go well with me," and Naomi is kind of she's not happy with God. She says that God has dealt bitterly with her. She even says, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara." In some sense, the story is really about, in some ways, more about Naomi than it is about Ruth, despite her being called that. And the big law that comes up here is this levirate marriage law. And this is really strange for us to think that a brother is supposed to marry his deceased brother's wife. Yeah. So that's, I think, Deuteronomy 25 or somewhere in there. Can you talk about that law? What was its purpose? And how does, in some ways, that's what Judah failed to do. He withheld the levirate from Tamar, and now Ruth is kind of taking that on, even though she doesn't have to.
The reason given for the levirate law is so that a name doesn't die. And you're to raise up your brother's seed, and so in one sense his name and his inheritance within the land doesn't get lost, doesn't get swallowed up. And so that is the purpose of it, and it's not, as is clear in Ruth, the situation wasn't simply about raising up the dead person's name and keeping it alive, but it was also all that he had, his possessions, his inheritance. Because you'll remember the land is divided up according to tribes, and each tribe's land is according to families, and that legal system is such that you don't want to lose those familial holdings, and certainly not those tribal ones. An example would be the daughters of Zelophehad. They said, "Can we inherit?" And Moses says, "Yes, you can inherit." And all the tribes went, wait a minute. But if they marry outside of the tribe, then we lose some of our land. They say, okay, you can inherit, but you can't marry outside of the tribe. And so because there's the protection on that land. And the Levirate marriage is tied up to all those sorts of ideas and those principles, which the Law of Jubilee, which we discussed in Leviticus, is also tied up to. And here, I mean, there's some question over the nature of the marriage to Boaz or the possible other one who's closer relative to him, and the ceremony and the taking off of the sandal and all those things. It's not an exact one-to-one correspondence.
There was no spitting in the face, which I was really disappointed by.
There was none of that, but it certainly seems related to that whole idea.
Yeah.
And so, but Boaz sort of, appears to not con the guy, but sort of play a little bit of a trick with him. Do you want so and so's land, Elimelech's land? He's like, that's a good idea. And he said, you're going to need, to meet them back. And he was like, oh my goodness, now I am, and this is not something that I gain. This is something I do for someone else.
Yeah.
And at that point, he withdraws, and which is why he's nameless.
Yeah.
He's refusing to honor someone else's name and raise up their name, and therefore he remains nameless in the book.
Yeah. So when that happens, so he gives this excuse that lest I endanger my own inheritance. Yeah. And I'm preparing to teach on slavery tonight at CRF, so I've been deep in the Jubilee laws and trying to understand the land there. And I wonder, is that true? Is that not? You also have this reality that if it's during the time of the judges, they're not really following the law anyways.
You could argue at any time in the Old Testament they're not following. The law observance is not it's not quite as it should be.
Yeah, they fail to live up to these ideals that God puts forth, and they're just these cautionary tales for us, as Paul says. Yeah. So do you think that there is something to? Does he have a legitimate this closer in kin? Do you think he had a legitimate reason to not, or do you think that's just a cop out when he says, I'll endanger my own inheritance if I do this?
I don't think the way that Ruth is written gives him a get out of jail free card.
Okay, it's meant to paint him in this negative.
Everyone goes, he's meant to raise up, and preserve someone else's inheritance, someone else's name. Yeah, and he doesn't. And calling him Ploni Almoni, so and so, is just the author's way of saying, you want to go down in history as so and so. Yeah. Oh, so and so. The guy wouldn't do that. So I don't think it's a legitimate excuse. Okay.
So one of the other things that is a major theme in this book is this idea of harvest. And this takes place, I think, at the beginning of barley harvest or something like that. So this would be at the beginning of the kind of ecclesiastical year where the Feast of Unleavened Bread happens, and then you have, I think he says, you can glean, he tells her she can glean until the end of wheat harvest. So it's like a whole 4 months or so there. What is the purpose of crafting this narrative so centrally around bread and gleaning, and there's also laws about gleaning that we've looked at. So what is the author doing with this theme?
I mean, the fact that it starts, the very fact that there are harvests and there's plenty of harvest is obviously a sign that something has changed, seeing we have, it's starting with a famine in the house of bread. A place of famine has now become a place of fruitfulness. And you have a barren, well, not necessarily barren, but possibly everyone thought she was. I mean, they were married for a while and then they died. She had no children. So this widow or two widows, one young, one old beyond but childbearing years, the other who's not had children. There's fruitlessness there, and I think the change from famine to harvest pictures, God's visiting the land, God being merciful to the land, and then that is, in one sense, reproduced in the fact you have this family going from complete barrenness and a name dying out to not only fruitfulness, but fruitfulness in a way that is Davidic. And so you have this dramatic turning on its head of what seems to be the direction of a particular person, a particular narrative, a particular story.
Yeah.
And obviously, harvest and seed and things are all part and parcel of that picture of fruitfulness that Ruth becomes ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, that's a major, just like death and resurrection kind of image throughout Scripture.
She goes from death to life, literally over this course of the book.
One of the questions, if you were just to read chapter 1, so Bethlehem starts out with this famine, but then by the end of chapter 1, as they go there, there's bread, and there seems to be something that's changed. And one of the questions you would maybe ask is, well, what has changed? And it seems like, well, you have Boaz there, and Boaz ends up being called, one of the pillars in the temple. Can you talk about this idea of the Goel, the kinsman redeemer and the blood avenger? He's both those things, and what kind of trace that theme even up into Christ, who is this true blood avenger and kinsman redeemer.
Yeah. So the Goel, the redeemer. In this instance, it's redeeming a woman from barrenness and redeeming a dead man's name from death and bringing it to life. Mm-hmm. And there's that element. You hinted at the Avenger of Blood, and when someone is murdered, there is a duty for that blood to be avenged, and so you have that picture of the Goel in the Old Testament as well, and it's God is described as the Avenger of Blood in one of the Psalms, particularly. It's not one of the ones that make it onto the devotional calendars, but that's the nature of it, and clearly Jesus is set out as that Avenger, but Goel also has the idea of a redeemer. So we think of redemption in a very narrow and a particular idea.
Yeah.
Israel was redeemed. We have been redeemed from sin. Jesus is our redeemer. And we sort of spiritualize it.
Yeah.
In the Old Testament, that redemption, covered all aspects of redemption. From
that was your insurance policy, basically.
From the judgment on those who would take someone's life to the idea of your land and your inheritance that was potentially being taken from you.
Yeah.
So.
The Goel, when I think about this theme that shows up all over the place of both blood, guilt needing to be dealt with, whether they got to run to the city of refuge, they got to pursue them, or the redemption part, especially as I'm thinking about all these slave laws right now. Yeah. If you didn't have land and you were poor, you defaulted on a loan, you really hoped you had a good Goel to come bail you out of sorts. And in some ways, the Goel is kind of like the answer to Cain, the evil brother who murders his brother, and he's the faithful next of kin, and that theme is huge, where Christ is the older brother that actually dies for for us rather than kills us when he could. So that's just one of the other major themes that I've noticed throughout this. Okay, what else do I have on here? Okay, we got to talk about chapter 3.
Okay.
Because everyone wants to know, what does it mean to uncover someone's feet? And what exactly happens when Ruth essentially proposes to Boaz? And is this a practice that we should bring back?
So chapter 3 is full of let's take it one step back. It's not the normal advice. So it's harvest time. Party has been going for a while. Mm-hmm. They're eating, they're drinking, and to advise Ruth to go down once get dressed up.
Yeah, like a bride.
Go down once it's dark. Wait till his heart is glad. So he's had a couple of drinks, and then go and find where he's sleeping and make sure no one sees you. It all feels a bit,
Makes everyone nervous.
Yeah, it makes everyone nervous. This is not
I'm
the
just
advice
being
you give
biblical.
It makes everyone nervous. And then on top of that, when you read it in the Hebrew, it really is packed full of euphemisms.
Yeah.
Many people have read it. I've had students who have done it in the past from years gone by, and I saw someone write an article on it just recently that they slept with one another, contracted the marriage, and then he went into the gate and conned the guy so it could cover it up type idea.
Yeah.
Uncovering his feet in English sounds like, well, what is he going to get cold? And then and the term for feet there could be anything from his feet up to his waist.
Yeah.
So it could be even more problematic than just uncovering his feet. There is all these euphemisms there. But the question we have, and people get excited about the euphemisms because it's the 21st century for some reason, and forget to ask why.
Yeah.
And I think this is the, in one sense, the heart of the story in terms of Ruth being revealed as a woman of faith, of Abrahamic faith in many ways, because everyone knows the Moabites' history. Mm-hmm. Everyone knows that the original matriarch of Moab got someone drunk, slept with him, essentially.
Yeah.
You would call it rape, and nowadays getting someone drunk and sleeping with them
right.
Without their permission, and gets pregnant, and that's Moab born. And then you have, as we talked about in Numbers 25, the Baal Por episode, Moabite women seducing Israelite men away to worship Baal, and so everyone knows that is the reputation of a Moabite woman, mm-hmm. and the author here goes, I'm going to play right into that reputation, but it's not going to be true. I'm going to make sure I know that's what Moabites are like. Ruth is not this. Yeah. She remains righteous, and Boaz, and it's at that point, at the most compromising moment in the story, in her life, and he says, you're a woman of valor. That's and everyone knows it. Yeah. Everyone knows it. Now, it doesn't say make sure you don't let anyone see you leave. Let's get up before. There's still awareness of it.
Yeah, he wants to protect that.
He's protecting that reputation, and so really it is a just as the patriarch leaves the land in famine and comes back wealthier is overturned at the beginning, mm-hmm. so the Moabite woman narrative gets overturned here in chapter 3, and Ruth is, shines out as righteous and true.
Yeah, he says, trying to find where it says, but he says, this last kindness is even greater than the first.
Yeah,
and one of the parts of understanding the Levirate law is that Ruth was not under obligation to do this. The first kindness I take as going back with Naomi and gleaning for her, so that taking care of her in her old age, honoring her father and mother. Yeah. And then the last kindness is she's essentially becoming a surrogate mother for Naomi. And we know this because at the end, Naomi is the one who, they say, there is a son born to Naomi. Naomi becomes the nurse to him. And that is what the great faith of Ruth is doing. It's on behalf of someone else, this person that she didn't have to follow, for the sake of really following through on her oath, or her conversion of sorts, to worshiping the one true God.
Yeah, and in one sense, Boaz is doing that, which highlights the Ploni Almoni unwilling to do that. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a stark. Everyone comes away going, you should be like Boaz, you should be like Ruth. Faithfulness on behalf of, not for your own gain in and of self, but for others. Yeah.
So let's maybe talk a little bit about just application. So what what are some of the kind of major lessons that we're meant to take away from this book? Maybe besides how to get married kind of questions, right?
I mean, one of the most striking things is, and I think this is part of the element of the story, is God takes the simple obedience of Ruth to the Torah, because she goes out and gleans, and as she does that, to look after her mother-in-law, who she didn't have to do. She could have left and gone back to her own parents. Yeah. That would have been, I think, she does that day in, day out, faithfully working extremely hard as a poor person with nothing of her own. God takes that and causes it to be abundantly blessed and fruitful, to the extent that David is, she becomes in the line of David and ultimately in the line of Christ.
Yeah. And
so, there's an element of, well, I don't know what I'm meant to do. I don't know what how am I meant to? I'm praying for guidance about. You go, okay. You've got lots of things you can do.
Yeah.
Just simple faith, trusting in Christ, doing what He's given you to do. Just live a faithful, obedient life.
Yeah.
And we got no idea how God will turn that around and use it. And so that's just a very simple, practical thing. And everyone wants to get into Jesus' genealogy. That's a pretty high on the Old Testament list of things to desire.
Yeah.
And it's striking the ones who do get on. Not all. Ruth. The striking thing about Ruth is she's a Moabite, but she's a Moabite who just simply did what was right to do.
Yeah.
And in one sense, obeyed her mother-in-law and put herself in a very compromising situation at the same time. So there's that element to it. Yeah, the theme of death and resurrection is clearly there in terms of from famine to fruitfulness, from barrenness to fruitfulness, from the time of Judges to the Davidic genealogy, and Christ is risen, and that's the business He's about. And we experience similar forms of death, hardship. I don't think any of us in the certainly in our context at the moment are experiencing famine. But there's a lot of people in financial hardship. There's a lot of people in difficulties. There's people who are bereaved, people who can't have children. All those things are a reality of our existence and our forms of death.
Yeah.
In biblical context.
Yeah.
And even in the Old Testament, here's Jesus doing what Jesus does. He takes death and brings resurrection. And so we should. That's how we should live. That's how we should pray. That's how we should hope. Even in the worst and most terrible and challenging of situations, we know that Christ wasn't abandoned to Sheol. He rose from the dead, and He has made turned death into life, and He can do that in all situations. There's no such thing as fruitless hardship.
Yeah.
In the Christian life.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about providence? And it's from Naomi's perspective at the beginning of the book. She's experienced this hard providence, and maybe there's all sorts of reasons why she could have ended up in this situation. Her husband was a dirtbag, or who knows. And then at the end, she experiences this great kind of change in her understanding of providence. So how can we understand what God is doing? Is it ever right for us to say with Naomi, the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me, or would that be sinful? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, in that particular instance, you have to ask the question: does the book itself lead you to that conclusion? And because the first thing that she says, when suddenly Ruth has bumped into Boaz, God hasn't forsaken his loving kindness from us.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be wrong for Naomi to say, I've been named sweetness, but you've been very bitter to me, and call me bitter.
Mm-hmm.
But on another occasion, it could be just a human, a psalmic response to difficulty, knowing that God has not forsaken his mercy.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to tell in this particular instance. I would veer with a more charitable reading rather than less charitable reading personally, because I think the Psalms are full of examples of this. And I did the midweek sermon weeks ago on Romans 8, glorious chapter. Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. Persecutions, death, nothing. Supreme confidence that even the worst of things, nothing can separate me from God. But he quotes Psalm 44. And Psalm 44, the immediate verse after the verse that Paul quotes is, God, what are you doing? How long are you going to leave us like this? What's happening? You're forsaking us. Act, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
And those responses are godly responses, because we have examples of them throughout the Psalms. And I think if we, how do I put this carefully? If we trust in the providence of God to such an extent that we no longer see the effects of death and sin and evil and suffering as wrong, and don't rail against them to God, then we've misunderstood the purpose of God's providence. We can be both completely confident that God will deliver us and nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ, and utterly rail against the form of death that we're experiencing in that providence. And those two things aren't contradictory.
Yeah. We'll end with that. The book of Ruth, it's a good one. Read it with Judges and read it also with Proverbs 31. And up next, we've got the story of the dynasty, the kingdom coming. Until next time, keep on